The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
How could an independent F1 team possibly dream of fighting for the World Championship? It's unthinkable today, but 2 decades ago it happened when Jordan came as close as it ever would to the big prize. We're of course talking about the 1999 F1 season, where after Michael Schumacher broke his leg at Silverstone, Mika Hakkinen eventually fended off Ferrari's Eddie Irvine and Jordan's Heinz-Harald Frentzen to win his second World Championship. Welcome to the latest episode of Bring Back V10s, the trip back into F1's past, brought to you by The Race. We're approaching the halfway stage of our first series, so please remember to get in touch with @WeAreTheRace on social media to let us know what you think of the podcast so far and what you'd like us to talk about in our series finale, and make sure you use the hashtag BringBackV10s. So joining me to look at Jordan's finest hour are Matt Beer and Ed Straw, back from last week's Damon Hill 1997 Hungary episode. Thanks for coming back, gentlemen, and we'll crack straight on with our traditional opening question, which is, when you think of Jordan's 1999 season, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And you're not allowed to say Damon Hill being rubbish.
A yellow car retiring from the race lead in a slightly strange way.
Mine's very, very similar. Just the image of the car stopped where it was by the first corner. That if you mention Jordan 99, that's just the thing that leaps to mind. I don't know, it's just seared on the brain, I guess.
Yeah, and that's of course when Frentzen broke down at the Nurburgring, and that was really when this championship dream shattered. But we'll come back to that shortly. 1999, an amazing season in Formula One, and there'll be so many more times in the future of Bring Back V10s where we revisit this season and some of the things that went on. But towards the end of the season is where we're focused today, because that's when everyone started to get the feeling that actually Jordan could pull off a championship upset here. And that feels remarkable now to look back, that this team had its peak for quite a short period, but legitimately it was fighting for a championship. Now, we know that the team won its first race at the end of 1998 with Damon Hill at Spa, and in 99 Mike Gascoigne had taken over from our own Gary Anderson at the team, and Gascoigne has said that really the 199 was mechanically an evolution of the old car with a new aero package put on it. That's what he told Motorsport magazine in a feature a few years ago. So Matt, how good do you think the 99 Jordan was? It was third in the Constructors' Championship, which was the only time Jordan finished that high. And that was when it had Hill not really scoring any points in the other car. So was this a legitimate championship contending car?
No, but it was probably Jordan's best overall. I would say it was the fourth fastest car that season. I think Stewart had a spectacularly fast car for much of that year, but it did spend quite a lot of its time on fire or with smoke billowing out of the back. But no, the Jordan was quick enough for Frentzen to put it on the front row at Monza, where he won when Hakkinen spun out. And to finish, like you say, third with just really one driver scoring. It was clearly faster than the Williams, but as we're bound to discuss quite a lot in the rest of the podcast, a lot of its closeness to the front in points terms was from McLaren and Ferrari getting things embarrassingly wrong.
And of course, Jordan running it pretty well. If you look purely at the numbers, it just sneaks in as the third fastest based on the absolute fastest pace, just ahead of the Stewart. But the Stewart had a lot of reliability problems during the season, so didn't come together that well. And I think they've done some work with the weight and getting the centre of gravity down a little bit lower. So I think it was one of those ones, as well as doing the aero changes, they did a little bit of top and tailing of some of the work they'd done in 98. 198, which of course had started with Gary Anderson, the race's own Gary Anderson, doing the Jordan 198 originally, but then Mike Gascoigne, who's technical director, really kind of running with that and improving significantly what the car could do. So it was quite a good, usable, solidly run car that was never kind of the absolute best car, but it was close enough for when circumstances came into play, they were able to do something.
Yeah, and circumstances came into play a lot in 99. Now, probably illustrating some of the points you've made there, Frentzen's average qualifying position for the season was 5.3, so fifth basically, which very much suggests best of the rest behind the four cars from McLaren and Ferrari if all was normal. And the first win that Jordan took earlier in that year was opportunistic. It was the French Grand Prix, a famous wet race that will get its own episode in the future. So that's why we're not really focusing on it today. But I think illustrating some of the points you made there, when Frentzen wins that race, he's not that far off in the championship, but nobody's talking about Jordan as a championship threat. And when Schumacher breaks his leg at Silverstone, there's still no talk that this could open up a championship opportunity for Jordan. Frentzen was incredibly consistent through that season. So his average grid position was, let's say, fifth. If you ignore the races he didn't finish, when he did finish, his average position was 3.2. So he was better on Sundays than Saturdays, you could say. And of course, as you referenced, Matt, at Monza, Jordan got its first and what would turn out to be its only proper dry weather win. And this race is also memorable for Mika Hakkinen spinning out of the lead, wandering off into the trees to have a cry and getting caught by a helicopter-mounted television camera. But after that retirement, Ron Dennis in McLaren said that Hakkinen made the mistake because he was driving so far inside his limits. Jordan had a different theory on that because they believe that they were putting pressure on Hakkinen. Frentzen was running second in that opening stint, having qualified on the front row. And although the gap was up to around 8 seconds, Frentzen started taking a little bit of time out of Hakkinen. And so Jordan's theory is that Hakkinen tried to respond to that because McLaren wanted him to keep a gap, and then he made the mistake. We know, Ed, that Jordan had a big fuel tank. In fact, one of the reasons they were able to win in France was because of the big fuel tank. But before we get onto Jordan, let's talk about Hakkinen, because Monza's a very famous error, but he'd also gone off in Ferrari country at Imola earlier in the year as well. So if we're looking at reasons that Jordan were able to have this perfect storm of a championship charge in 99, do we have to look at perhaps Hakkinen being a bit more fragile this year than he was the year before?
It certainly played its part, particularly in races in Italy. As you've alluded to, obviously Monza, he went down to first gear rather than second gear at the first chicane, rears locked, off he spun. He took responsibility for that mistake. But at the time, I mean, coming back to that line Ron Dennis said about the fact Hakkinen was cruising, he was being given the pushboard, and in that race, they were concerned about this being one of those races where those running longer could then really kind of chew up lap time, because obviously you've still got healthy tyres, shall we say, and then you've got very little fuel. Austria, I think, was the race that really got inside McLaren's heads on this one, because there, David Coulthard, having punted Hakkinen into a spin, was leading. I think he had about 10 seconds on Irvine, and then he made his last stop 5 laps earlier, and Irvine was taking like 1.8 seconds a lap out of him and then won the race as a result of that offset. But I think they vastly overestimated what was happening at Monza. If you watch that race with timing, as I've done quite recently, you don't see any of those offsets with people who are running a bit longer. So actually, I think they were too worried. But yeah, pushing Hakkinen on. There was a lot. I think collectively there were a lot of weaknesses from McLaren that year. Hakkinen also lost a lot of points through no fault of his own, through being hit by DC in Austria. The tyre went at Hockenheim. So it's a strange one. I think Hakkinen was a little bit fragile at times, and he did admit at the start of the season he struggled to kind of pick himself up to go for the championship again. But whatever happens, that Hakkinen McLaren combination was not scoring the points that it really should have done. So I tend towards Eddie Jordan's interpretation of events, and it was those shortcomings that helped Jordan, at best the third best package, to get in the hunt.
I think Hakkinen was definitely fragile to a degree through both his championship seasons and then into 2000 as well. But I do think a lot of that fragility came from the fact that really he should have been walking those 2 championships, and for reasons quite often not his fault at all, he wasn't. If you look at the stats, he had 20 pole positions across his 2 championship seasons, so pole for more than half the races. The most poles anybody else got was 6. the McLaren was the fastest car on pure pace at the majority of races across those 2 years. Hakkinen was the faster McLaren driver. And through the car braking, through his teammate whacking into him, sometimes for his own mistakes, but more often than not for something out of his hands, what should have been straightforward championships were becoming very high pressure and stressful. And when you had people as relentless as Schumacher and Ferrari, or as relentless as Ferrari without Schumacher still turned out to be in the second half of 99, yeah, that was getting inside his head.
And actually, Hakkinen has admitted the Monza mistake was a bit of a wake-up call, that they needed to really focus and not leave anything on the table.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think, you mentioned Austria there, Ed. McLaren shouldn't have read too much into that, because that was just a bad day at the office for David Coulthard. Yes, he wiped his teammate out and then didn't drive very well after that, so he sort of handed the race to Irvine while Hakkinen...
Exactly what he said in the post-race press conference, pretty much what you just said there.
Yeah. So I have no problem taking that swipe at him, because he gave it to himself at the same time. Eddie Jordan obviously loved the idea of getting under the skin of Ron Dennis. Now, they had a better relationship, I think, behind the scenes than maybe the one they played out in public. And Eddie Jordan loved playing up to that. And after Frentzen wins at Monza... Jordan says, right now I'd have my money on Frentzen before I would Hakkinen. The McLarens have the speed, which is what Matt was talking about, but either the team or the driver has screwed up on too many occasions. There is a litany of failure, and they should have won the championship by 50 points, and it should be all over by now. But they have another contender in the shape of Heinz-Harald, which nobody expected. Ron is a great competitor. I admire the guy, and I think his team is sensational. But if I had a team as good as that and I'd not won the World Championship by now, I would be sick. And Dennis probably was feeling like that by this point, because I think you've got to think that Schumacher would have beaten this fragile McLaren-Hakkinen partnership to the 99 title, but McLaren kind of got away with that one, with Schumacher not being a factor in the second half of the year. Now, Jordan has talked about how he used to deal with Ron. Eddie loves giving an interview, and he's written an interesting book as well. And he said that the biggest compliment Ron ever paid him was after Monza, when he said to Eddie, at least you've won one race by merit. Because, of course, at that point, Spa 98 and France 99 were both crazy rain-hit races, where Jordan did a very good job. He deserved those wins on the day. So we head to the Nurburgring, and at this point, Frentzen is 10 points behind Hakkinen and Irvine with 3 races to go, and this is back when we were only 10 points for a win. Irvine, who wasn't very good at Monza, I think we can all agree. He then talks about Frentzen in an Irish newspaper column, and he says, in theory, Frentzen's win puts him in the running along with me and Mika, but the truth is he is a red herring. Much as I respect what my old boss Eddie Jordan has done with his team, Heinz-Harald's victory was down to the fact that this track suited their car. It will all come down to a scrap between me and Hakkinen. So, Matt, if we think back to 1999, after the Monza win, did you think that Frentzen was a championship contender now? Looking at what Irvine said there, Jordan had been fast at other high-speed tracks such as Hockenheim and Spa before we got to Monza. So perhaps, was it a credible theory that it was just a car that was good on that type of circuit?
Well, I think at that point, 21 years ago, the wildly optimistic Frentzen fan part of me that still hadn't quite given up from 97 definitely thought, yes, he was a contender, but realistically, it was more because of the fragility of McLaren and the fact that Jordan by that time was looking like a serious second best package. Irvine's championship bid was largely based on an excellent fortnight across Austria and Germany when he was very impressive in the way he first stepped up with Schumacher gone. But as soon as things started to get more difficult for Ferrari, Irvine's results were absolutely nosediving, and the Jordan looked like the car that was going to be there to pick up the pieces, almost regardless of the track. So, yeah, 10 points with 3 races to go was still a very tough ask for not the fastest car up against Hakkinen and McLaren, but Jordan had been best of the rest or nearly best of the rest everywhere. Hakkinen and McLaren were still shipping points. Irvine and Ferrari looked completely all at sea by that time. So, yeah, Frentzen was a solid long shot.
I think solid long shot is about as good as it would have been. The car still wasn't the equal of the McLaren, certainly over kind of an on-average circuit, shall we say. I can't really tell looking back. I think I was more concerned with Damon Hill underperforming as a Damon Hill fan at the time. Obviously, this is before my journalistic career started. Obviously, in retrospect, he was performing dreadfully and Frentzen was being mighty. But it was still, if you look at the circumstances going into Monza, it was still a long shot, because even if Monza was going to be good, they still had a number of tracks where there's no real reason to expect them to be good, including Nurburgring, actually.
Yeah, I think no one else was paying any attention to Damon Hill by this point of 99, Ed. But a very quick note, in fairness to Eddie Irvine, he has said that he felt that Ferrari switched the development off on the 99 car not long after Schumacher broke his leg, and then towards the end of the season, a lot of the 2000 wind tunnel work had thrown up some bits that they could put on the 99 car towards the end of the season, so that's why there was maybe a little revival of Ferrari's fortunes. But certainly at this point, Ferrari and Irvine weren't looking massively like a factor. Eddie Jordan, Matt, seemed to be looking at it the same way you put it. He said that, they were still a long shot. He felt that the dry weather win proved once and for all that the Jordan 199 was a serious contender. In public, he's still saying, yes, we're the outsider. But he also said, at the start of the season, if we'd been told we'd be fighting for the title, or if we'd said we were fighting for the title, we would have been laughed at. So just to be where we are is fantastic. But when we get to the Nurburgring, Jordan brings some updates that they've tested at Magny-Cours. Strange place to test new parts, if you ask me. And they go there actually thinking, right, we can show some dry weather pace here. And Frentzen has a sort of disrupted weekend, and even qualifying is a stressful session where they're not entirely sure he's going to get out for another run at the end. But he goes out at the end and he puts the car on pole. And this was the point for me where I thought, hang on a minute, this could really happen now. Jordan have properly got their act together. And Eddie Jordan says that actually what Frentzen did that day under that amount of pressure was a measure of where he was at and where he was performing in 99. So, Ed, do we think that, was this the peak of Frentzen's Formula One career? He had the time at Williams where it didn't work out for whatever reason, but once he'd been released from those Williams shackles, he's at Jordan, a completely different environment. And by this point, he's on fire, isn't he? And there's an interesting note that we've seen in some interviews and recently on social media, actually, from Mike Gascoigne, where he said in 99, Frentzen just turned up and drove the car. And he actually struggled after that because he got too involved with trying to engineer it. So would you say this was absolute peak Frentzen at the end of 99?
Yeah, you'd probably have to say that, because he's a curious driver, Frentzen, a huge amount of pace and ability. And we saw some wonderful performances with Sauber in his early years in Formula One. At Williams, his season in 97, when he only won one race alongside Jacques Villeneuve, was probably better than it looked. He had some misfortune as well, but he also had some areas where he wasn't at his best. So I always felt he was a driver who perhaps was a little bit mentally fragile and needed to kind of get that momentum and get onto a bit of a crest of a wave to really perform at his absolute best. And when that happened, he was brilliant. And in fact, we did see later years with Jordan, he kind of declined to the point where he got ousted mid-season in the end. So, yeah, curious. I would say, if you want to pick a peak, probably actually Nurburgring qualifying is the absolute peak to go for, because I don't think he really had any business being on pole position. It was a tricky and odd qualifying session. So again, there are a few circumstances that helped create the opportunity, but he'd had a difficult session. He just went out and nailed it right at the end of the session. They did kind of a quick racing pit stop, didn't they, to get him turned around and back out on the soft tyres to give it a go. So the fact that in the race he had McLarens all over him, first Hakkinen and then Coulthard in the dry phase of the race before he made his stop, tells us that he wasn't really supposed to be on pole position. I think we have to put that down to Frentzen absolutely nailing it. We know he was the guy who could beat Schumacher, wasn't he? That's what he was before he came into Formula One in his early years with Sauber. And I think we had moments where we saw that, but he couldn't string it together for consistent periods, and probably 99 as a whole was the point where he came closest to consistently delivering the driver performances that people said he did have when he was considered that Schumacher beater.
Now, Matt, last week in our Hungary 97 episode, you said that you had a lot of theories about Frentzen from 97, that when you went and looked back at them, you went, actually, no, he wasn't as good as I thought he was at the time. But is this the period of his F1 career where everything you've gone back and looked at and you thought, oh no, he really was that good?
He was better, possibly. No, I've always thought of 99 as the moment Frentzen showed what his whole career probably should have been. There was a slight sketchiness to Frentzen throughout his career. Like you said, Ed, he was billed as the Schumacher beater. But there's that famous picture when he was in the Mercedes Junior program of him, Schumacher, and Wendlinger with Peter Sauber at an event, and everyone's wearing a smart suit and tie, and Frentzen's in a terrible jumper. And it's a tiny thing, but it's just a little hint of just not all the details being in place, not having attention on all the things he absolutely needs to. And the fact that Williams didn't work out for him. Sauber, his first stint there, had so many promising days, but also some disappointing ones as well. And then he gets into this year at Jordan, and he just comes across like someone who's free and relaxed and can bring all his talent out without all the things that were either complicating it for him or he was allowing to complicate for him in his own head. And I think that 24 hours at the Nurburgring was the absolute peak of his career. That was such a messy, not just session, but weekend. He missed a lot of practice running and then just goes out and then on a properly dry track at the end with a bit of extra fuel because they were trying to get as much running in as possible at the end. He puts in the fastest lap of the weekend up to that point, head-to-head with the two McLarens on a dry track. It was properly sublime and, yeah, definitely his F1 peak in that single lap, I'd say.
He was perhaps a driver who was helped by the circumstance of going into a team with an evolutionary, well-sorted, proven car. He was undisputed number one because Damon Hill was going a season too far in his career. And I think probably that kind of unshackled him a little bit. And he didn't have to do too much work in terms of making the car good. And it probably was in that right window for him. Whereas someone like Schumacher was the guy who always made it work for him and was always there. Whereas Frentzen, I think, probably needed to be in that little narrow window for it to really work and him deliver his best.
I'd argue your undisputed number one point, Ed, bear in mind that end of 98, Hill was Jordan's first Grand Prix winner and was like Benson and Hedges' darling. And Frentzen comes in as a bit of a weird choice, having just discredited his career with his Williams stint, really. But within one race, it's clear that Frentzen, is the team's best hope.
Exactly. Number one status is decided by pace, isn't it?
Yeah.
He may have been signed as a good backup to Hill, but yeah, within about 5 seconds of the season starting, it was Frentzen's team, and that presumably helped him.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, we'll do Damon Hill's 1999 another time because Damon's actually very good on talking about that, even if you can't quite work out why he was so slow. So we're on to race day, and this is the heartbreak that we talked about at the top of the episode. So we'll come back in a moment to the moment where Frentzen exits the pits and the car grinds to a halt, that haunting image that we talked about, and the moment that this all goes up in... it wasn't actual smoke, was it? There wasn't any smoke, but the title chances went up in smoke. Now, at the time, it was a very mysterious failure, and Jordan were very secretive about what had gone on. But in the years that have passed since the incident, we've learned a bit about what went on that day. And there were a few teams, I think, in 1999 who were finding clever ways to get around the ban on driver aids. And Jordan had... effectively a legal, through some loopholes, launch control system. But the trick they had required the driver to manually disable it after the launch, otherwise the car would shut down. Now, this happened to both Jordans in this race. If you remember at the start of the race, Pedro Diniz ends up flipped upside down and his roll hoop is ripped off of his Sauber. And that's because he went over the back of, or he went upside down after an accident that was triggered by the same thing happening to Hill at the same point of the first two corners at Nurburgring. So Hill's car stops, and then there's a multiple car accident, and Diniz comes barreling in and flies over the back of possibly a Benetton. But before we get on to Frentzen, Ed, let's just briefly talk about that incident, because you said you've watched the race back quite recently, and that's a very scary crash, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a horrendous accident, and as soon as you see the roll hoop being damaged like that, it's worrying for the driver because it's there to protect them, obviously. Looking back at some of the information from it, it was a 95 km/h impact initially on the roll hoop, which led to the main kind of structure then failing, and then there's secondary structures in there, and there's the high cockpit sides that helped him. And actually, Pedro Diniz was in pretty good shape after this. He was fine. He didn't have to miss a race, and he had a bruised shoulder and knee. But it's a really, really nasty accident for him. And I think it also, for those of us who were paying attention to German F3 at the time, there'd been an accident not long before, in fact, where Wouter van Ooywyk, a Dutch driver, had flipped there. The roll hoop had failed and he'd actually been paralysed. So it had quite a few similarities being in the same place. So, yeah, a very fortunate situation for Diniz. But there was a reason why they had secondary structures and other bits and pieces. So they weren't only relying on the top of the roll hoop to save the driver, but it could have been a whole lot worse.
Yeah, it looked like his head had been squashed, and it's a testament to where F1's safety was at that point that he was okay, and F1's come a long way since then as well. So I don't think we'd see a similar failure today. So back to Frentzen, who leads the first stint of the race, and then he comes in for a pit stop, and it's after his pit stop that he forgets to disable the mechanism that we're talking about. But Eddie Jordan says that Sam Michael, who was Frentzen's race engineer at the time, Eddie effectively pins some of the blame on him, because Jordan says in his book, each time without fail, Sam would say to Heinz, press cancel, as a reminder. On this occasion, he simply said, you've got 4.5 seconds on Ralph, bring it home first. And then Eddie says, no sooner had Sam said that than we heard Heinz reporting that the engine had cut out. It was the most sickening feeling to see the pictures of our car rolling to a halt. The rest of that race is absolutely crazy. It's wet, dry. Johnny Herbert ends up winning it for Stewart. And it's quite interesting. At the moment, we've got a lot of classic F1 races being shown on the F1 YouTube channel. And every time they announce the race that they're doing, they're getting bombarded with requests for Nurburgring 99. So we will do a separate episode on it another time, definitely. So we don't need to get too much into everything else that happened in the race. But with how crazy it went, and I think you've already hinted at this, Ed, can we assume that Frentzen would have won this race, or was it too crazy to predict that, given that Hakkinen and Irvine were, scrambling around at the end to try and get back into the points?
I don't think we can assume it. What we can say is he was in the position to win the race. He just made his pit stop, obviously, hence the switch issue happened. But we were only a few laps away from the downpour coming that caused all sorts of chaos. However, having said that, he made his stop. He was ahead of Johnny Herbert. So if we take Johnny Herbert as the kind of fulcrum for the win, he's got position at that point. But then Herbert hadn't made his stop and was then able to come in for wets initially. Then he made another stop for slicks. So there were a lot of curveballs being thrown at people, and mistakes were made, and incidents happened to all sorts of people. So you can't say he would have done, but what we can say is that he was in a good position. He'd covered David Coulthard, who was chasing him at the time. He pitted on the same lap. He pulled a few seconds on Ralf Schumacher, who was having a wonderful race in the Williams, in fact, really, really good performance. But he had an advantage over him. So at the point he exits the race, he is in control. Whether he'd have stayed in control is another matter, but he was a handy driver in mixed conditions. He was on good form, so there's no reason to say that it wouldn't have happened. But then again, something might have broken 4 laps later that we'd never known about anyway. So who can say? When these things happen, you just can't be sure. But yeah, he had the race that had happened to that point won. Let's put it that way.
And also, let's not forget that if anything, once it becomes a wet dry race, that's Jordan territory based on this era of F1.
Oh, precisely. You look at the data set that was available. To win that race, you need to make the right tyre call at the right time, judge the weather right, and not make mistakes under pressure. Well, that's how Frentzen won at Magny-Cours with Jordan's strategy as well. And you look at the first 30 laps of the race at the Nurburgring, and Frentzen and Jordan judge that first shower right. They don't make an unnecessary pit stop there. He resists pressure from 3 faster cars because Ralph was quicker at that point as well. Gets away with skipping over the chicane a couple of times, a little bit cheekily, the second time particularly. But everything that he needs to do to stay ahead and win the race, he'd already shown he could do in the first half of the race and at Magny-Cours early in the year. So based on that, I'll say with absolute certainty that he definitely would have won.
You can say that probably Ralf Schumacher was the driver in the race at that stage, best place to challenge him. And obviously, Ralph's challenge came unstuck. He would have won the race, but he had the problem. So he would have been out of the way, shall we say? So, yeah, but it becomes a little bit of a crapshoot at that point. He might have arrived because the rain was hitting at uneven points, wasn't it? At some points, it was absolutely cascading down. So for all we know, it might have started raining. He just hits a puddle, and off he goes, and forgotten about. So, yeah. Who knows?
Yeah, it's one of those great races where so many people could have won it, so many people threw it away or had bad luck. And we'll come back to Ralf Schumacher in '99. I think he was driving really well by this point. and was on a real upward curve. But Matt, I think in the end, Hakkinen finishes fifth and Irvine's out of the points. So was this a massive let-off for McLaren and Ferrari? Because they had a shambolic second half of the race as it was all going wrong. Maybe they were too cautious or too struck by fear of messing up the championship. But if Frentzen had kept going and had won this race, he'd have made massive inroads again into Hakkinen and Irvine. So was this a real let-off?
Oh yeah, completely. I think you can see this race as a kind of microcosm of all the missed opportunities that McLaren and Ferrari were generating throughout that season. Top teams can flounder in crazy races. They're used to things following a quite carefully enacted plan. They're used to being able to rely on pace advantages, and suddenly when it's raining on 6 corners but not on the other 7, and then it stops and then it snows or something, and then there's a car upside down with no roll hoop, that's not really top team territory in the same way as it might be for a dice rolling Jordan team or Stewart team on this occasion. And the state of Ferrari in those pit stops, there's that comedic image of Eddie Irvine's car with 3 wheels on it and just no one really knowing where the 4th might be. If Frentzen had won the race, he'd have been equal on points with Irvine, and Hakkinen would have had 1 fewer, wouldn't he? Because Frentzen would have actually finished. So 1 point behind Hakkinen with 2 races to go. Obviously, the rest of the season didn't play out that well for Jordan, but at that point, it would have been an enormous upset, and Jordan would have looked not like title favourite, but a totally legitimate contender because McLaren and Ferrari allowed it to be.
Yeah, the momentum would have really been with Jordan by that point. And that Irvine pit stop, I think it still annoys me to this day. And there's a famous bit of Martin Brundle commentary, I think, where he says they're having a committee meeting, just stick a wheel on it and send him down the pit lane. And I'm very quickly going to detour here because that race is, in a way, is responsible for me choosing a career in motorsport journalism, because I had an English project I had to do at the time, which was to write 2 newspaper articles, one being balanced and one being biased. And I was thinking, what the hell am I going to do this about? And really wasn't sure. That race happened, and then I wrote my 2 reports, and my balanced one was Stewart wins crazy, brilliant Grand Prix, isn't F1 wonderful? And my biased one was Ferrari throws it away, Ferrari shambles, blah, 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 slag them off. So, yeah, and, I didn't find it that difficult. I got an A, and I thought maybe I should keep doing this. And here we are 21 years later talking about it again. So thank you to the teacher that gave me an A.
I thought your biased one would be, did Jacques Villeneuve produce the best 10th place finish ever?
Oh, it was an incredible drive. He was the moral winner of that Grand Prix and every other race that he took part in.
Thank you for reminding me that Jacques Villeneuve was in that race.
Yeah, even I didn't remember what happened to him.
I think he retired late on, actually, had a clutch problem or something, so it was classified. But
I'm sure he retired because he was in a 99 BAR that was incapable of finishing a race. Ed, Matt mentioned there that Jordan's season petered out after this. Can we perhaps put that down to the disappointment of Nurburgring? Because Frentzen was a bit rubbish at Sepang. He qualifies 14th, does race his way into the points and sets the 2nd fastest lap of the race. Michael Schumacher was back at this point and was miles quicker than everybody. But do we think that Jordan's end of the season would have been different if there'd still been a championship on the line? Like, did the bubble just burst at the Nurburgring?
I think it's very tempting with a driver like Frentzen to put it down to that, because we know, as we discussed, he had some mentally fragile moments, and that was comfortably the worst qualifying performance of the season. 14th, he was never outside the top 8, I think, elsewhere. But Jordan was really struggling. It was new track, low grip, had a spinning qualifying when the headrest detached, had to switch to the T car, which I don't think he'd driven. It didn't have the qualifying engine. The brake problems, the front left brake caliper wasn't working qualifying. So it's only really right at the end of the session when he actually had a shot to qualify properly, and he didn't have a brilliant lap, but everything was against him in that. And then he had that decent run to 6th. They were behind the Stewarts, but the Stewarts, when things worked, were quick cars. So I think, yeah, tempting as it is to put it down to that, they still had a Constructors' Championship to fight for, and there was still, I guess, if a miracle happened, half a chance of him getting back into some form of contention for the overall title. But I don't think there's much evidence to say that was really a kind of downtrodden, downbeat Frentzen just being knocked out of his operating window. I just think it was one of those weekends where things did not go well.
Yeah, maybe we sort of everything reset to normal after that weekend, because Frentzen was 12 points behind with 20 available from the final 2 races. But as we mentioned, Ferrari threw some bits at their car, brought forward some 2000 developments to try and help Irvine at the end of the season. And maybe, as you've said, McLaren and Hakkinen got a bit of a wake-up call and got themselves back into gear, because I think Frentzen was a sort of quiet fourth in Japan. And, that was where Jordan's, the peak for Jordan was over by this point. And Eddie Jordan says that the end of the 99 season was a bit of an anticlimax. And in his book, he says, yes, we finished third in the championship, but the fizz seemed to go out of that last race because we knew we could not win the title. Everyone was depressed, but we had no reason to be. Jordan was third. That was fantastic. We had done brilliantly for a team that had started less than 10 years previously. We had hauled ourselves up in a very short period of time from being no-hopers to having a crack at the world title. In public at the time, he said, hopefully this is the year I remember as the one that gave us the confidence to make a serious breakthrough to take on the World Championship. With 20 years of hindsight, we know that's famous last words from Eddie there, and this was as good as it would get for Jordan. Do we think that the fact that it never scaled these heights again, did this prove that the team was punching above its weight in 1999? Or just, as I think we've hinted, that maybe the level of the top teams came down to Jordan and it created perhaps a false impression?
It's not so much punching above its weight as the weight it had to punch at was kind of at Jordan's level, which is a very convoluted way of saying that.
I think that was one of the options I gave.
The F1 was about to go manufacturer crazy. The following year, BMW's turned up with Williams. Ford's coming in a big way with Jaguar. Okay, that was a disaster, but it shows the level of investment going on. Toyota was just around the corner. Honda was about to get really serious, but not with Jordan in the end, with BAR. So this was a year when there weren't enough really, really big, high-functioning teams to fill the kind of top 3 or 4 in that sense, with Williams and Benetton well into their declines by that point. So you could be a Jordan level team was a very competitive best of the rest, and if the best was screwing up as much as McLaren and Ferrari were, then so that made it unique circumstances really, where a team in Jordan's position could be there to pick up the pieces. I think Jordan perhaps overcomplicated after that in response, and it ended up with quite a fragile 2000 car. I hadn't seen that Jordan quote until recently, and it's terribly sad now to think how optimistic that time felt. It was hard not to love Jordan at that point, as I'd started working as a journalist by then. But if I had a soft spot for anything left, it was that Jordan Frentzen title run storyline.
There was quite a big effort being made by Eddie Jordan to try and kind of keep up with everyone as they expanded. Obviously, the Honda thing hadn't come off, but he'd sold 40% of his stake in the team to an American company, Warburg Pincus, at the end of '98 to get some investment to put into facilities and expanding the team, etc. I think probably what was underestimated is just how insane that manufacturer era then did start going, because it was possible for a sensibly sized team to just invest sensibly and compete with people. But I think that, combined with the fact that Jordan, as you said, Matt, didn't quite build on it in the way they should have done. They're a little bit erratic for the next few years, and that led to, Eddie Jordan wasn't going to pour some of the money, too much of the money he'd made off the team into it, and why should he? He built up that team remarkably, so it's only fair that he was able to benefit partly from it. But the team just wasn't going to be able to match the other ones without the manufacturer involvement. So in retrospect, it was a perfect storm. But I can see exactly, as you said, Matt, at the time, Jordan probably thought, well, Jordan was doing all the right moves to try and keep pace with that. But at that time, nobody foresaw that 20 years down the line we'd be talking about teams of the size that we're talking about now. These are enormous, monstrous teams. Lewis Hamilton talks about a 4-figure number of people who are contributing all round to his car and engine package, which is just absolutely crazy. They've ceased to become a racing team; it's an industrial organisation, isn't it? So, I think probably through no fault of the Jordan team and Eddie Jordan's own, really, I think the main mechanism was the explosion in Formula One, and perhaps it was a shame that he didn't. That the deal for Honda to buy the team didn't happen, because it was very, very possible that they could have bought Jordan instead of buying BAR. I think their valuation their valuation was too low for Eddie Jordan. I think was the ultimate stumbling block for that one. So a big what if, but they enjoyed their ride while it lasted, and to his credit, Eddie Jordan got out the other side in a good position. Plenty of bankrupted themselves in Formula One, and why the hell should he after what he'd done?
The other thing about Jordan's title run was it was very much the end of an era and the end of a kind of hope that you could start out running a team in junior single-seaters, be good at that, work your way up, get enough funding together and some clever designers to build a Grand Prix car and be genuinely competitive, rise up through F1 as well. And Jordan and Sauber, which had a slightly different route because of its Mercedes link, the fact that they're still around in slightly different forms, very different forms in some ways, but at the core, the same base, some of the same people, those two teams gave such hope to other ambitious team owners at the time. But with all those manufacturers just kind of looming over the horizon at the start of the 2000s, it's been absolutely impossible for anybody from that background to break into Formula One and stick around since, let alone become a title contender. So it wasn't just the end of an era for a short era for Jordan, it was the end of an era for really the whole setup of F1.
I think the point you made there, Matt, about the fact it's still around as Racing Point is very important, because although the team went through some awful times, obviously it became Midland, became Spike, then it became Force India, and then clawed its way back up to being able to finish fourth in the Constructors' Championships a couple of times in recent years, and then great hopes for what can happen, rebranding at Aston Martin next year, etc. And there's still a lot of that Jordan DNA in that team. There's still people, as you say, who are
same factory.
Exactly, same factory, and in fact the team in its current form is quite keen to kind of underline that heritage as well. That there is a straight line going all the way back to what Matt was talking about when it was just Gary Anderson of the race, as it were. He said many times he didn't think it was going to happen. He was told there was a factory, turned up to the race shop at Silverstone, found there was nothing in it. So the first thing he had to do was kit it out. So it is that. I think that's probably why Jordan resonates so much, as it is the kind of defining underdog of that era. And we should also say, even though maybe things would have been different had Honda brought it, it doesn't necessarily mean that things would have gone brilliantly had that happened, because manufacturers come and go. Sauber was bought by BMW and was very close to going out of business not so long ago as a result.
Honda's works team ended up being rubbish as well.
Exactly, yeah. And the Honda Works team was rubbish, and that almost stopped. I mean, as it happened, it rose again as Brawn, and then currently as Mercedes. But yeah, there's no guarantees from this sort of thing. So I think you have to, when you look back at a team like that, you have to have a look at what it was able to do, and it was pretty improbable, all things considered, that it was so strong. To finish third in the Constructors' Championship with what amounts to a one-car team, really, because, as Damon Hill will admit, it was a season too far. He wasn't able to contribute a huge amount of points. Is a phenomenal achievement for a small team, and we haven't really. I don't think we've been able to see a small team do that since then. And yeah, so what if they capitalised on McLaren and Ferrari underachieving, on the fact Williams was having a little interim spell between Renault and BMW when it was struggling a little. That's what they're there to do, and all credit to them for being able to do that, because so many of those teams that started at the same time, late 80s, early 90s, 91 Jordan started, fell by the wayside without doing anything whatsoever. So to go from where they started to a team that probably shouldn't have even got on the grid, to do that, yeah, huge amount of credit's deserved for that, and I don't think we should look at what happened after as a kind of terrible decline and a failure to capitalise. I think the world was absolutely against them.
Yeah, everybody else started to raise their game, didn't they? So BMW came in with Williams a couple of years later. Benetton, who were rubbish in '99, they were the works Renault team. So yeah, the F1 landscape changed around Jordan. And I think it's a really good point that Eddie makes when he says that in less than a decade they achieved all of this. And you've only got to look at some of those other teams that were coming up, even years after Jordan. You know, who were the last couple of teams to properly step up from the junior ranks into F1? Would it be fair to say Pacific and 40? And they were both hopeless.
Yeah, they were dreadful. Yeah, Pacific and 40. BAR was effectively a new start. They bought the Tyrrell entry, and there was a little bit of carryover, but that was a big money operation. And then you've got the later wave. You could sort of argue that what was the Virgin team, later Marussia, later Manor, was sort of the Manor junior single-seater team, but it sort of wasn't. Same people, but a new startup team. And then Haas recently, which is a totally different model. So yeah, no one was able to do it. And Jordan was even able to, in its very late days win that ridiculous 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix, we shouldn't forget as well, which is actually one of the worst cars to win a Grand Prix, you could argue. So it still had a touch of magic right to the end of its years as Jordan, even getting a podium in the last year when the Jordan name was on the chassis in 2005 with Thiago Monteiro in the US Grand Prix we shouldn't really mention.
Oh, we will mention that race in the future. And we'll mention Brazil 2003 as well. But for now, talking about Jordan's heyday, we've come to an end, and we'll look back at some other great Jordan stories in the past. So that's the end of another episode of Bring Back V10s. Remember to get in touch with us on social media at We Are The Race. Let us know your thoughts and memories from this era and questions for us to take in our final episode. Those questions are starting to come in. Some of them are incredibly random and requiring a bit of research and jogging our memory so we can answer them for you in the final episode. We'll be back next week when Indy 2005 will get a small mention, actually, because we'll be focusing on Ferrari's disastrous 2005 season and how it all went wrong after those years of dominance for Michael Schumacher. Indy, of course, was the only victory that year, but because it's worth its own full episode in the future, we won't spend too long on a dark day for Formula One. But that's the subject next week, Ferrari and the 2005 disaster and everything that went wrong for Schumacher, Barrichello, Jean Todt, Ross Brawn and everyone else who was there. And we look forward to joining you for an in-depth discussion about that next week.